Hello everyone. Today in this topic of cost function related to macroeconomics, where cost is primarily presumed to be a function of quantity. So our focus will be primarily on the definition or the meaning of the word cost, its basic classifications, that is types, and how we can say that cost is a function of quantity. That is how we will focus in this session, and our earlier sessions on the same topic. We will continue that journey. So, before I move into this function relationship between the cost and the quantity, we should first understand that economics is primarily about the creation of commodities, that is, the goods and the services, which to satisfy the wants, the needs of the consumer. So, this commodity or the product has to be produced or bring into existence, and all those expenditures, irrespective of the fact that whether they are paid or they are paid explicitly, so whether they are paid explicitly or even if not paid, they are required for the production or to bring the product into existence. So, irrespective of the fact that any expenditure, whether it is paid or not, but the important thing is any expenditure which is necessary to bring the product into existence, then all those expenditures will be deemed or known as cost. So I'm again saying that before I land into this question that how cost is a function of quantity, we have to first understand that any product or the commodity will come into existence if there are various expenditures which are incurred by the producer to get such product. And these expenditures can either be expressly paid or they may be induced or they because they are necessary for the product to come into existence, and hence they will be also known as cost. Therefore, because we have stressed that whether they are paid or not, so those expenditures or those costs which are being expressly paid are known as explicit costs, and those which are not though expressly paid but are the prerequisite to bring the product into existence, they are known as the implicit costs. The one of the foremost example of the implicit costs can be the interest on own capital, यानी कि ओनर ने जो अपने बिजनेस में अपना पैसा लगाया है, जिसे आप कॉमन सेंस में ओनर्स फंड्स या इक्विटी बोल सकते हो, उसके ऊपर आपको इंटरेस्ट पे नहीं कर रहे हो, लेकिन उस इंटरेस्ट को कॉम्पेंसेट करने के लिए या तो आप कंपनी डिविडेंड के तौर पर डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करती है, बट उन फाइनेंशियल टर्म्स में ना जाके ये प्रिज्यूम करें कि अगर वो पैसा इंटरेस्ट का होता तो आप उसे एक्सप्रेसली पे करते. सो इफ द इंटरेस्ट पेड ऑन लोन is an express payment, so those people who don't have their money and they have taken the loan and they are paying interest, so if such interest paid by them is named as the expenditure on the product, hence the cost, but because it is expressly paid we have used the word explicit cost. On the similar lines, if the funds are provided by the owner himself, that is he has not taken any loan from the outside, then obviously he is not expressly paying any interest, but the interest that could have been paid on such funds will be deemed as the implicit cost, and it will also be a part of the cost. It will also be a part of the cost. In addition to these two concepts, we will also focus on the term opportunity cost, and these opportunity costs will be important to identify all implicit costs as associated with the product. So we can say simple terms that opportunity cost is the cost of best alternative gone. This definition is word to word which has been mentioned in the various books. But what is said that it is the cost of the best alternative gone. But when we analyze it, then if we take an example of rent, the rent shall always be a cost, rent of the premises of the business. तो जहाँ business की activity हो रही है उस business premises का जो rent है that will always be deemed at the cost. But if the property is not owned by the owner, that is, it does not belong to the owner, then the rent is paid. And because the rent is paid, therefore it denotes an explicit cost. It denotes an explicit cost. But if the property is self owned, that is, the owner has its own property, then no rent is paid. But if the property could have been let out, then they must have been receiving the rent. So the rent, but the rent foregone, जो rent आपको नहीं मिला, that is the rent that could have been received. That is the rent that could have been received if the property was let out. Then, and presuming that we will get the maximum rent, then this rent foregone will denote the opportunity cost. And this opportunity cost, in a way, is a kind of implicit cost. It is a kind of implicit costs. So, understanding and finalizing that all costs which are either paid explicitly or which are required for the product implicitly will constitute the total cost of the product. Will constitute the total cost of the product. But when we analyze this total cost, let's say through an example. So the first example that I put was rent or the interest. And if I compare these two costs with the raw material consumed, that is the cost of raw material consumed, so there seems to be a stark difference between the two. How? That if the company is in the process of making 1000 units, and if due to the increased demand the output increases to 1200 units, which can be produced within the available premises, then I'm saying if these enhanced units can be produced within the available premises and with no extra funding required, then the rent, which if in the earlier case was say 10,000 rupees and the interest was 5,000 rupees, then even after the increase in the production, the rent will remain to be 10,000 and the interest will remain to be 5,000. So there will not be any change in the total cost of rent and interest even if the output is increased. So such costs are primarily known as fixed costs, and these fixed costs look to remain constant of output. तो आउटपुट से इन कॉस्ट के ऊपर कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता. But if I take an example of the raw material, presumingly that one unit requires, let's say, 0.5 kilogram of raw material, and 1 kilogram of raw material, 1 kilogram of raw material can be available in the market, say rupees for rupees 10. So it denotes that the raw material cost per unit will be 10 into 0.5, that is rupees 5. So it will imply here that the cost of raw material in case of 1000 units shall be 5000 rupees, and in the case of 1200 units it shall be 6000 rupees. So there looks to be a increase in such total costs, but their per unit cost looks constant. And if we analyze again here the fixed cost remains constant of the output, and this fixed cost is actually the total fixed cost. But if we calculate the per unit figure here, so this rent figure of 10,000 in case of 1000 units was rupees 10 per unit, but the rent will remain same 10,000 even after a production of 1200 units. So here the figure will come out to be approximately 8.33 per unit. So there looks a decrease in the, so there is a decrease in fixed cost per unit with increase in output. And if we see reverse, then we can say that there is an increase in the fixed cost per unit from 8.33 to rupees 10 if the output has decreased. So we can say it is vice versa, which is not the case with this case. So this cost which remains constant per unit but increases in total is known as the variable costs. Will be known as the variable cost. And this variable cost in total can be zero at zero output. So this variable cost looks to be directly proportional to the quantity, and this fixed cost does not look to be proportional or related to the quantity. And if we combine the two costs, that is the total fixed cost plus total variable cost, known as the total cost. So if we take that this total fixed cost is say rupees 15,000, so at an output of 1000 units, the total cost will be equal to total fixed cost 15,000 plus total variable cost, which will be 1000 into 5. So the total cost will be 20,000 rupees. But if we take the output as 1200 units, then we can say this total cost equal to the total fixed cost plus total variable cost. So this will be, the fixed cost will remain same and the variable cost will now become 1200 into 5, that this total cost comes out to be 21,000 rupees. So this total cost seems to increase with an increase in output. So presumably the total cost, if shown by the symbol C, looks to be a function of quantity in direct proportional, and that is how we started our discussion. So moving forward, if I again calculate here the total cost per unit, so it will be 20,000 divided by 1000, and the figure will come out to be rupees 20. But if I see the total cost per unit here, that this will come out to be 21,000 upon 1200, And if I correctly calculate it, then this will be 21,000 divided by 1200, and this figure is coming out to be 17.5 rupees. And if you analyze that, if you analyze that in this total cost figure, the variable cost per unit is rupees 5, and the fixed cost per unit is rupees 15. And if we analyze the cost here, then the variable cost per unit will again be rupees 5, that is here, and this fixed cost per unit will be rupees 12.5. And how this 15 has been calculated? 15,000 divided by the 1000 units, and now it has been calculated 15,000 divided by the total quantity of 1200. Total quantity of 1200. So if you can see above that the variable cost per unit, the variable cost per unit has remained constant irrespective of the output, and the fixed cost per unit has clearly decreased with the output. So if we draw all these things on a graph, that if on the x-axis we take the output, that is the quantity, and on the y-axis if we take the cost, that is the amount, that is the C. So, and this figure 0 denotes that at 0 output the cost is 0, but that is not the case, because there will be always a figure of fixed cost of 15,000 rupees which will be incurred even if the output is 0. So the fixed cost has to be a figure of 15,000, and the graph will run parallel to the output line. But if we calculate the variable cost, then this variable cost graph shall start from 0. So this graph, if added to the fixed cost graph here, it will learn parallel to the variable cost graph, and the difference between the two will be the total fixed cost. So I shall take it as total variable cost and total fixed cost. So this will be the total cost, underlining from here that the total cost is equal to total variable cost plus total fixed cost, and hence, because the graph is increasing in comparison to the output line, we can say that the cost is a function of quantity, and this cost is total cost. So we can now be on a position that we seem to understood the meaning of the word cost. We seem to understand the primer classification of the types based on their relationship with the quantity, and we seems to understand how this term, that cost is a function of quantity, is derived. Now, in addition to these discussions, some people say that if we take a figure of output and we take the figure of total fixed cost, so even if the output is 0, you have taken the total fixed cost. So now I am creating a new case with smaller figures. Smaller figures and the data will be increased in per unit format. So if on output of 0 the total fixed cost is rupees 50, and if I increase the output by 1, by 2, by 3, by 4, by 5, this total fixed cost is looking to be same, that is the 50 in each time. So this total fixed cost is not related to the output. But if I take the figure of the total variable cost, then there can be two scenarios. There can be case 1 or there can be a case 2. This case 1 we have already discussed, that if at the 0 output we will see that the total variable cost will be 0. But if the total variable cost at one output is 50, then at 2 it will be 100, at 3 it will be 150, at 4 it will be 150, and at 5 it will be 150. Sorry, there is an increase of 50 in every unit, so I just wrongly mentioned it, that it will become 200 and it will become 250. Then you will notice that each increase in the output has caused an enhancement of rupees 50. So we can say that the variable cost per unit has remained constant. The variable cost per unit, the variable cost per unit has remained constant. So the graph here was a line of straight, and therefore the total cost graph was in addition to the total fixed costs, and it was in parallel to the total variable cost as discussed above. But some people believe that if output is 0, then the total variable cost is 0, and if output increases by 1 unit, it has increased by 50, and if the output increases by 2, then the variable cost is 90, then it could have become 150, then it could have become 220, and so on. So what is happening here, that in the beginning the increase was 50, then it became 40, and then it became 70. So what it justifies, that the variable cost per unit increases less, ये कम बढ़ता है, increases less in beginning and increases more later. It means the total variable cost is increasing in proportion to the quantity. So it justifies that the total variable cost is a function or directly proportional to the quantity, but variable cost is not increasing at the rate it was in the beginning. So it increased slowly in the beginning, and that it will be increasing at a higher rate. So they say that it will be a S-shaped graph. That is, this graph shall be a graph like this, and hence this graph of total cost will be a slightly S-shaped graph. It will be, if it starts with 0, then it is the total variable cost. If it starts with the total fixed cost, then it is a total cost graph, as we have seen it here. So in that case we can say, so the graph of the variable cost, and hence, or I can again repeat, the graph of the total fixed cost, and therefore the graph of the total cost can either be a straight line, or it can be a S-shaped graph, depending on the position, that if the variable cost increases in constant form, then it will be a straight line, And if the variable cost per unit increases slowly in the beginning and at a higher rate in the later stages, then it will be a S-shaped graph. So on this note, we will finish this session of function, where we seem to have understood the total cost will be equal to total fixed cost plus total variable cost, and we will take up another sessions on this cost function, and where we will be discussing the concept of average cost and the marginal cost. So this session was on the meaning of the word cost, what is cost function, what are the types, and how the total cost, total fixed cost, and total variable costs are related. This has been discussed, and we will move further in our sessions to come. On this note, this is Deepak Gupta writing off. Thank you. Goodbye.